Section 32 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4, by Henry Gray. The Vagus Nerve. 5J, the vagus nerve. Nervus vagus, 10th nerve, pneumogastric nerve. The vagus nerve is composed of both motor and sensory fibres, and has a more extensive course and distribution than any of the other cranial nerves, since it passes through the neck and thorax to the abdomen. The vagus is attached by 8 or 10 filaments to the medulla oblongata, in the groove between the olive and the inferior peduncle, below the glossopharyngeal. The sensory fibres arise from the cells of the jugular ganglion and ganglion nodosum of the nerve, and, when traced into the medulla oblongata, mostly end by arborizing around the cells of the inferior part of a nucleus which lies beneath the ala cinerea in the lower part of the rhomboid fossa. These are the sympathetic afferent fibres. Some of the sensory fibres of the glossopharyngeal nerve have been seen to end in the upper part of this nucleus. A few of the sensory fibres of the vagus, probably taste fibres, descend in the fasciculus solitarius and end around its cells. The somatic sensory fibres, few in number, from the posterior part of the external auditory meatus and the back of the ear, probably join the spinal tract of the trigeminal as it descends in the medulla. The somatic motor fibres arise from the cells of the nucleus ambiguus, already referred to in connection with the motor root of the glossopharyngeal nerve. The sympathetic efferent fibres, distributed probably as preganglionic fibres to the thoracic and abdominal viscera, i.e. as motor fibres to the bronchial tree, inhibitory fibres to the heart, motor fibres to the esophagus, stomach, small intestine and gall passages, and as secretory fibres to the stomach and pancreas, arise from the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. The filaments of the nerve unite and form a flat cord, which passes beneath the flocculus to the jugular foramen, through which it leaves the cranium. In emerging through this opening, the vagus is accompanied by and contained in the same sheath of dura mater with the accessory nerve, a septum separating them from the glossopharyngeal which lies in front. In this situation the vagus presents a well-marked ganglionic enlargement, which is called the jugular ganglion, ganglion of the root. To it the accessory nerve is connected by 1 or 2 filaments. After its exit from the jugular foramen, the vagus is joined by the cranial portion of the accessory nerve, and enlarges into a second gangliform swelling called the ganglion nodosum, ganglion of the trunk. Through this the fibres of the cranial portion of the accessory pass without interruption, being principally distributed to the pharyngeal and superior laryngeal branches of the vagus. But some of its fibres descend in the trunk of the vagus, to be distributed with the recurrent nerve and probably also with the cardiac nerves. The vagus nerve passes vertically down the neck within the carotid sheath, lying between the internal jugular vein and internal carotid artery, as far as the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, and then between the same vein and the common carotid artery to the root of the neck. The further course of the nerve differs on the 2 sides of the body. On the right side, the nerve passes across the subclavian artery between it and the right innominate vein, and descends by the side of the trachea to the back of the root of the lung, where it spreads out in the posterior pulmonary plexus. From the lower part of this plexus 2 cords descend on the esophagus, and divide to form, with branches from the opposite nerve, the esophageal plexus. Below, these branches are collected into a single cord, which runs along the back of the esophagus, enters the abdomen, and is distributed to the postero-inferior surface of the stomach, joining the left side of the celiac plexus, and sending filaments to the lienal plexus. On the left side, the vagus enters the thorax between the left carotid and subclavian arteries, behind the innominate vein. It crosses the left side of the arch of the aorta, and descends behind the root of the left lung, forming there the posterior pulmonary plexus. From this it runs along the anterior surface of the esophagus, where it unites with the nerve of the right side in the esophageal plexus, and is continued to the stomach, distributing branches over its anterosuperior surface. Some of these extend over the fundus and others along the lesser curvature. Filaments from these branches enter the lesser omentum and join the hepatic plexus. The jugular ganglion, ganglion jugulare, ganglion of the root, is of a greyish colour, spherical in form, about 4 mm in diameter. Branches of communication. This ganglion is connected by several delicate filaments to the cranial portion of the accessory nerve. It also communicates by a twig with the petrous ganglion of the glossopharyngeal, with the facial nerve by means of its auricular branch, and with the sympathetic by means of an ascending filament from the superior cervical ganglion. The ganglion nodosum, ganglion of the trunk, inferior ganglion, is cylindrical in form, of a reddish colour, and 2.5 cm in length. Passing through it is the cranial portion of the accessory nerve, which blends with the vagus below the ganglion. Branches of communication. This ganglion is connected with the hypoglossal, the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic, and the loop between the first and second cervical nerves. Branches of distribution. The branches of distribution of the vagus are: in the jugular fossa, meningeal, auricular; in the neck, pharyngeal, superior laryngeal, recurrent, superior cardiac; in the thorax, inferior cardiac, anterior bronchial, posterior bronchial, esophageal; in the abdomen, gastric, celiac, hepatic. The meningeal branch, ramus meningeus, dural branch, is a recurrent filament given off from the jugular ganglion. It is distributed to the dura mater in the posterior fossa of the base of the skull. The auricular branch, ramus auricularis, nerve of Arnold, arises from the jugular ganglion and is joined soon after its origin by a filament from the petrous ganglion of the glossopharyngeal. It passes behind the internal jugular vein and enters the mastoid canaliculus on the lateral wall of the jugular fossa. Traversing the substance of the temporal bone, it crosses the facial canal about 4 mm above the stylomastoid foramen, and here it gives off an ascending branch which joins the facial nerve. The nerve reaches the surface by passing through the tympanomastoid fissure between the mastoid process and the tympanic part of the temporal bone, and divides into two branches. One joins the posterior auricular nerve, the other is distributed to the skin of the back of the auricula, and to the posterior part of the external acoustic meatus. The pharyngeal branch, ramus pharyngeus, the principal motor nerve of the pharynx, arises from the upper part of the ganglion nodosum, and consists principally of filaments from the cranial portion of the accessory nerve. It passes across the internal carotid artery to the upper border of the constrictor pharyngeus medius, where it divides into numerous filaments, which join with branches from the glossopharyngeal, sympathetic, and external laryngeal to form the pharyngeal plexus. From the plexus, branches are distributed to the muscles and mucous membrane of the pharynx and the muscles of the soft palate, except the tensor veli palatini. A minute filament descends and joins the hypoglossal nerve as it winds around the occipital artery. The superior laryngeal nerve, nervus laryngeus superior, larger than the preceding, arises from the middle of the ganglion nodosum, and in its course receives a branch from the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic. It descends by the side of the pharynx behind the internal carotid artery, and divides into two branches, external and internal. The external branch, ramus externus, the smaller, descends on the larynx, beneath the sternothyreoideus, to supply the cricothyreoideus. It gives branches to the pharyngeal plexus and the constrictor pharyngeus inferior, and communicates with the superior cardiac nerve behind the common carotid artery. The internal branch, ramus internus, descends to the hyothyroid membrane, pierces it in company with the superior laryngeal artery, and is distributed to the mucous membrane of the larynx. Of these branches some are distributed to the epiglottis, the base of the tongue, and the epiglottic glands. Others pass backward in the aryepiglottic fold to supply the mucous membrane surrounding the entrance of the larynx, and that lining the cavity of the larynx as low down as the vocal folds. A filament descends beneath the mucous membrane on the inner surface of the thyroid cartilage and joins the recurrent nerve. The recurrent nerve, nervus recurrens, inferior